I first noticed him on a Tuesday night. It was one of those evenings when sleep felt elusive, and the glow of my computer screen was the only source of light in my small, second-story apartment. The quiet suburban street outside was dark except for the occasional flicker of a street lamp. I was nursing a cup of coffee, more out of habit than need, staring blankly out the window when I saw him. He stood there in the house directly across the street, motionless and shadowed, framed by the second-story window. From my vantage point, I could barely make out any details. Just a dark silhouette against the dim interior light of the room. But what unnerved me was his stance. He faced directly toward my apartment, as if staring right through my window and into my soul. At first, I assumed it was some late-night insomniac like me. Maybe a tired office worker lost in thought or someone taking in the quiet of the neighborhood. Still, something about the way he stood, unnaturally still, almost rigid, made me uncomfortable. I turned off my desk lamp, plunging my room into darkness, and moved closer to the window, hoping the dim lighting would give me a better look without making myself visible. The figure didn't flinch. He just stood there, as if frozen. I couldn't even see a head turn or any indication of breath. I decided not to think too much of it. Maybe he wasn't staring at me. Maybe it was a trick of perspective. Still, the unease lingered as I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up tighter than usual. I fell asleep with the curtains tightly drawn. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing, just a neighbor who'd left his lights on and happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. By day, the house looked completely ordinary, a two-story suburban home with neatly trimmed hedges and faded beige siding. It had been on the market for a while, I remembered. I hadn't noticed anyone moving in. That night, he was back. Same window, same stance, same unnerving stillness. His silhouette was clearer this time, and the shape of his head seemed wrong. It was almost oblong, stretched unnaturally upward. I thought it might be a trick of the shadows or the angle, but no matter how much I squinted or adjusted my position, the distortion remained. I tried ignoring it. I told myself people had their quirks. Maybe it was some art project or meditation routine. But as the hours ticked by, my curiosity turned into dread. He never moved. Not a single twitch. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that his presence wasn't natural. I called a friend. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "You ever notice anyone living in the house across from me?" "You mean 27 Blackthorn?" he replied after a moment. "Nah, man. That place has been empty for months. Didn't the Petersons move out last spring?" I swallowed hard. Yeah, I think you're right. Must have been seeing things." Mark laughed it off, made a joke about how I was probably overtired from staring at my screens all day. But as I hung up, I couldn't shake the chill that crept up my spine. Empty. The house was supposed to be empty. The next night, I decided I wasn't going to watch. I pulled the curtains shut before sundown and avoided the window altogether. But my resolve didn't last long. Curiosity burned inside me like an itch I couldn't scratch. By midnight, I was back at the window, peeking through the narrowest gap in the curtains. He was there again. But something was different this time. He was closer. I swear it wasn't my imagination. The figure was no longer standing in the second-story window but had moved to the ground floor. The interior lights cast a faint glow behind him, silhouetting his form more clearly than before. His posture was the same, rigid and unyielding, but now I could see more detail, or lack thereof. His face was a smudge of darkness, devoid of features. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just an unnervingly smooth void. My breath hitched. I stepped away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I picked up my phone and dialed the local police station. My voice trembled as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. I left out the part about the face, opting for something less likely to get me labeled a crank. "There's someone standing in the window of an empty house," I said. They've been there every night for the past 3 days. It's unsettling. The dispatcher promised to send someone to check it out. Just stay inside, she said. I stayed by the window, watching. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up outside the house. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They approached the front door cautiously, one knocking while the other scanned the perimeter. I watched intently, feeling a sliver of relief. But then, after a few minutes of back and forth, they left. I called the station again. What happened? Did they find anything? The dispatcher sounded hesitant. The officers checked the property. The house is locked up tight. No signs of anyone inside. I stared out the window, my grip tightening on the phone. But he's there. I can see him right now. Sir, she said, her tone firm but polite. There's no one in the house. Maybe you're just tired. I hung up before she could finish. My pulse thudded in my ears. When I looked back out the window, the figure was gone. The following day, I noticed something new. Tracks. Thin, winding trails in the dirt just beneath my window. They weren't footprints exactly, more like grooves etched into the ground, as though something heavy had been dragged. They led from the sidewalk, across my lawn, and stopped abruptly beneath my bedroom window. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until dawn, my heart pounding every time the floor creaked or a distant car rumbled by. The tracks beneath my window haunted me, impossible to explain, harder still to forget. Who, or what, had left them? When daylight finally seeped into my room, I ventured outside to examine the tracks more closely. The grooves were deep and uneven, as if something sharp had gouged the earth. I crouched to get a better look and noticed faint, jagged impressions along the edges. They looked almost like claw marks. The trail led from the street to my window, and then, nowhere. No continuation, no return path. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished into thin air. I considered calling the police again but hesitated. After last night's dismissal, I doubted they'd take me seriously. Worse, I wasn't sure I wanted them to come back only to find nothing again. I'd start sounding like the neighborhood lunatic. Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, I set up a camera by the window. My old camcorder was dusty but functional, its battery life enough to last until morning. I positioned it carefully, aiming it at the house across the street, and hit record. Hours passed as I sat in the dark, watching the footage live on my laptop. I didn't dare look out the window directly, not after the figure had vanished last time. The video feed showed the house, still and lifeless, bathed in pale moonlight. And then, just past midnight, he appeared. I froze, my eyes glued to the screen. The figure was back in the window on the ground floor, staring directly toward me. He was clearer now, illuminated by some faint, unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from within the house. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the image. His head was tilted slightly to the side, as if listening, or watching me even more intently than before. The smooth, featureless face still sent chills down my spine, but this time, something else caught my attention. His arms. They were unnaturally long, hanging far past where his hips should be, almost to his knees. The joints looked wrong, bending at impossible angles as he shifted ever so slightly in place. For the first time, he moved. It was slow, deliberate. He raised one impossibly long arm and pressed a hand, if you could call it that, against the windowpane. The movement was eerily fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. I couldn't tear my eyes away as his other hand followed, pressing flat against the glass. Then, he began to lean forward. The screen flickered. "No," I whispered, frantically adjusting the laptop. The video feed stuttered and distorted, lines of static crawling across the image. When it finally stabilized, the window was empty. I turned to look out the window myself, heart hammering in my chest. He wasn't there. But when I glanced back at the laptop, something new appeared on the feed. A reflection. My reflection. No. Not mine. Standing behind me, just out of focus, was the figure. I spun around, fists clenched, but the room was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I searched every corner, every shadow. The door was locked, the curtains drawn tight. It didn't make sense. When I looked back at the screen, the reflection was gone. I shut off the camera, unable to bear the thought of seeing him again. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed Mark. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. "I need you to come over." "Dude, it's almost 1 a.m., he grumbled. "Please," I begged. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. After a long pause, he sighed. "Fine. Be there in 15. When Mark arrived, I didn't waste time explaining. I dragged him to the window and pointed toward the house. "I'm not crazy," I said. "Just look." He peered out cautiously, his expression skeptical. "I don't see anything." I frowned, pulling the curtains open wider. The house was dark now, the window empty. "No," I insisted, "he was there. He's always there." Mark put a hand on my shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe you need to take a break, man. Get some fresh air. You've been cooped up in here too long." Frustrated, I grabbed the camcorder and rewound the footage. "I recorded him," I said, shoving the screen toward him. "Watch." But when I played the video, the figure was gone. The window was empty, the house as lifeless as ever. "No," I muttered, scrolling back and forth through the footage. "He was there. I saw him." Mark's frown deepened. "There's nothing here, man." I felt the blood drain from my face. The reflection, the distorted figure standing behind me, it was gone too. Mark stayed for an hour, trying to convince me to get some rest, but I barely heard him. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. Had I imagined it? Was my exhaustion messing with my head? When he finally left, I locked every door and window, checked every closet, and turned on every light. But no amount of security or illumination could ease the gnawing dread in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I woke to a knock at the door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled toward the sound. A package sat on the doorstep. No return address. I hesitated before picking it up. It was heavier than I expected, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a single object, a weathered, handheld mirror. A note was taped to the back. "He sees you too." The mirror sat on my kitchen table like a loaded gun. I didn't dare touch it again, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The glass was old, warped around the edges, with a faint spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center. I kept rereading the note taped to its back, as if the words might change. "He sees you too." I had no idea who had sent it, or how they knew what I'd been experiencing. My first instinct was to throw it out, but something about it felt important. Dangerous, yes, but also crucial. Like it was a piece of a puzzle I hadn't fully assembled yet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that touching it had been a mistake. My fingertips tingled where they had brushed the tarnished frame, a sensation that was now spreading up my arm like an icy burn. By the time night fell, the unease had grown unbearable. I kept the curtains shut tight and stayed as far from the window as possible, pacing the apartment while my thoughts churned. What if this was escalating? The figure had gotten closer each night. First the second-story window, then the ground floor, then... I shuddered, my mind conjuring the impossible reflection I'd seen on the camcorder. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The house across the street, maybe? It seemed like the obvious choice, but the thought of stepping foot inside made my stomach churn. Then there was the mirror. I approached it cautiously, as if it might bite, and crouched down to examine it more closely. The surface was cloudy, the kind of distortion that came with age and neglect, but I could still see my reflection, at least, I thought it was my reflection. My face looked pale and drawn, but there was something else, too. A shadow, faint and indistinct, lurking just behind me. It was so subtle that I almost missed it, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. By midnight, the tension had reached a breaking point. I couldn't sit still, couldn't think clearly. I had to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. Grabbing my flashlight and a crowbar from the hall closet, I steeled myself and crossed the street. The house loomed large and silent in the dark, its windows like empty eyes staring down at me. I paused at the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. Locked, of course. But the back door wasn't. The creak of the hinges was deafening in the stillness. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew and stale dust. The house was in worse shape than I'd realized, cracked plaster, warped floorboards, and cobwebs clinging to every corner. I made my way through the rooms slowly, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The furniture was sparse and covered in sheets, as if the previous owners had left in a hurry. But there was no sign of the figure. Then I reached the living room. The floor was covered in tracks. They were identical to the ones I'd seen outside my window, long, shallow grooves gouged into the wood, as if something heavy and sharp had been dragged across it. The trail led in a looping pattern, circling the room before disappearing into the hallway. I followed it, my grip tightening on the crowbar. The trail led to the basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining my flashlight down into the blackness. The steps were steep and narrow, the walls closing in like the throat of a cave. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave the house and never look back. But the thought of returning home, of facing another night with the figure inching closer, was worse. I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the concrete walls, casting long, jittery shadows. The basement was almost empty. Just a bare concrete floor and a few scattered tools. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. A mirror. It was taller than the one I'd received, framed in ornate, twisting iron that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The glass was pristine, perfectly smooth and reflecting the room with uncanny clarity. And standing in the reflection was the figure. He was impossibly tall, his elongated limbs bending unnaturally as he leaned toward me. His featureless face was turned directly toward my reflection, though he made no move to step out of the glass. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Then, slowly, the figure raised one long, claw-like hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. The sound was faint but distinct, a dry, scratching noise, like nails on a chalkboard. Then he spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was low and guttural, resonating like a distant growl. "You invited me." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted his head, as if amused. "To be closer." The glass began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. His hand pushed through, the tips of his fingers breaching the barrier between his world and mine. I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran. The stairs felt endless, each step an eternity as I clawed my way back to the surface. Behind me, I heard the glass shatter, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. I didn't look back. When I burst out the back door and into the night, I didn't stop running until I was back inside my apartment, every door and window locked tight. But I knew it wasn't over. The mirror was still sitting on my kitchen table. And now, the faint, distorted reflection in its surface was no longer mine. It was his. The mirror's surface pulsed faintly, as if alive, the reflection subtly shifting even though the room around it was still. His silhouette lingered in the glass, faint but unmistakable, a looming, featureless figure with those unnaturally long arms. I turned away, unable to keep looking. My breathing was shallow, my thoughts spiraling out of control. What had I unleashed? I needed help. Mark was the only person I trusted, but after the way he dismissed my earlier warnings, I wasn't sure he'd take me seriously now. Still, I had no other option. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number. "Hey," he answered groggily. "It's late, what's up?" "It's real, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "The thing I told you about, it's real. I saw it." There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting on the other end. "Look, man, I'm worried about you. Maybe you need to take a break from." "No." I snapped, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "You don't understand." I went into the house. There was a mirror, another mirror. It came through, Mark. "It's here." He sighed, and I could tell he was trying to remain patient. "Okay. Slow down. What do you mean it's here?" I glanced at the kitchen table, where the mirror sat like a black hole, devouring the light around it. "I think it's watching me. I don't know how to explain it, but it's in the mirror. And it's getting closer." Mark was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, "I'm coming over." Mark arrived within 20 minutes, dressed in sweats and a hoodie, his hair a mess. The relief I felt at seeing him was quickly eclipsed by my growing dread as I led him into the kitchen. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the mirror. "Okay," he said slowly, running a hand through his hair. "That's creepy. Do you believe me now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He crouched in front of the mirror, squinting at the surface. "I don't see anything. It's just a reflection." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" "It's just us," he said, gesturing at our reflections. "I mean, yeah, it's old and creepy looking, but—" "No," I interrupted, pointing at the faint figure in the glass. "Look closer. He's right there." Mark frowned, leaning in. "Dude, I don't see anything." "Are you sure you're not just—" A faint scratching sound interrupted him. We both froze. The noise was coming from the mirror, soft but insistent, like nails scraping against the inside of the glass. Mark stood up abruptly, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I told you," I whispered. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. The surface of the mirror rippled, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. Mark took a step back, his earlier skepticism evaporating. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking. "This is not normal. What do we do?" The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it felt deafening. Then the voice came again. "Closer." The word was low and distorted, echoing in a way that didn't match the acoustics of the room. The mirror's surface began to warp, bending outward like a bubble about to burst. "We have to get rid of it," I said, my panic rising. "We have to destroy it." Mark nodded, grabbing the mirror off the table. He hesitated for only a second before smashing it against the floor. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction. For a moment, the room was silent again, and I thought it was over. Then the lights flickered. The temperature dropped sharply, a freezing chill seeping into my bones. The shards of the mirror on the floor began to move, shifting as if guided by an invisible hand. They slid across the tiles, reassembling themselves into their original shape. "No," I whispered, backing away. The mirror was whole again, but now the reflection was different. The room in the glass wasn't my kitchen anymore. It was the basement of the house across the street. And standing in the center was the figure. Mark grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We bolted out of the apartment, the chill following us like a shadow. As we reached the street, I glanced back at my window. The figure was there, watching us from inside my apartment. "What the hell is this thing?" Mark asked as we ran. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But it started with that house. We have to end it there." We reached the house across the street, the front door still ajar from my earlier visit. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, as we made our way to the basement. The mirror was waiting for us. It stood in the same corner, its surface now alive with writhing shadows. The figure was gone, but the oppressive presence remained. Mark picked up a rusted crowbar from the floor. If smashing it didn't work, maybe we need to burn it. I nodded, grabbing an old oil can from a nearby shelf. My hands shook as I doused the mirror, the liquid dripping onto the floor and filling the air with the sharp scent of kerosene. Mark struck a match. For a moment, nothing happened. The flame hovered in his hand, the room deathly silent. Then he tossed it onto the mirror. The fire roared to life, engulfing the glass in seconds. The mirror screamed, a high, keening wail that vibrated through my skull. The shadows writhed violently, trying to escape the flames, but the fire consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The mirror was gone, reduced to a pile of ash and twisted metal. We stumbled out of the house, coughing and shaking. The night air felt impossibly fresh, the weight of the oppressive presence finally lifted. Back in my apartment, the temperature was normal, and the eerie stillness had disappeared. The mirror on my kitchen table was gone, leaving only a faint scorch mark where it had been. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But as Mark and I sat in silence, trying to process what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The figure might have been destroyed. But the house across the street was still standing. The next few days were a blur of unease. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted my apartment was gone, but in its place was a different kind of dread, one born of anticipation. I kept catching myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. Mark insisted that I stay at his place for a while, just in case, and I didn't argue. He didn't say it out loud, but I could tell he was shaken. The experience had rattled him, and while he tried to play it off as relief, I knew he wasn't convinced that the nightmare was over. Neither was I. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 nights later. Mark and I were sitting in his living room, trying to distract ourselves with bad TV. The tension between us was palpable, every noise from outside made us flinch. It was just after midnight when the power went out. The TV shut off, plunging the room into darkness. "Probably just a blown fuse," Mark said, his voice steady but tight. I wasn't so sure. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. Mark grabbed a lantern from a closet, its dim glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Stay here," he said, heading for the breaker box in the garage. I nodded, though I wasn't thrilled about being alone. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive. I sat on the couch, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. And then I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the front window. I froze, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable, gentle, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap. 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 "Mark?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I got up and approached the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain. Tap. I yanked it open. The street outside was empty. Mark returned a few minutes later, his brow furrowed. "No issues with the breaker," he said, setting the lantern on the coffee table. "Must be an outage in the area." I told him about the tapping, my words tumbling out in a rush. "There was nothing there," I said. "But it sounded so close." Mark frowned, glancing at the window. "Maybe it was just the wind." I shook my head. "It wasn't the wind. It was." I stopped, unsure how to explain. "It's back," I finally said. Mark didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed his car keys. "We're going to the house."